Today, we'll be going through understanding UX friction, tips and strategies for creating smooth user experience. So Luke is also here manning the chat. Feel free to drop your questions, thoughts, comments in the chat throughout the webinar. I think everyone here has some valuable insight to share on this topic, so we'd love to hear from you all as we go. All right, so before we get into it, today's content is brought to you by LogRocket, and we do have an exclusive offer for attendees of the webinar today. Anyone who signs up for a LogRocket trial and records a session replay or attends a demo can get some sweet LogRocket swag. And if you're already a customer, just shoot me an email after the webinar. It's will@logrocket.com, and we can get you some swag as well. All right, so who's this guy? I'm Will Berner. I'm one of the growth managers here at LogRocket, and I will be the host today. So one of the things that we focus on a lot as a company is this idea of helping our customers identify and remove unnecessary UX friction from their digital products. And apologies in advance, I'm going to say the word friction about 600 times today. So it's something that's been in my head for a really long time, even when I'm just personally browsing the internet or downloading a new mobile app, always keeping my eyes peeled for frustrating experiences. And also a big part of our go-to-market over the past 4 or so years has actually involved signing up for and trialing thousands of different software products. So I've actually personally signed up for and trialed about 1,000 products in the past few years. So I've been able to document a lot of interesting things, some really good things, a few things that aren't so good. And we'll get to look at a few examples of those later on in the presentation today. Okay, so I'll make this part quick. What is LogRocket? Our overall mission is to help software teams build better digital experiences. The way that we do that is by telling you everything there is to know about how users experience your digital products. And we break this out into 3 distinct but overlapping buckets. The first being this idea of session replay, which is essentially recording videos of end users as they navigate your web or mobile application. You can kind of think of it like a DVR for web applications. Yes, we will be sending out the recording after. We also have this idea of issues, which is the idea of proactively surfacing problems with your digital products, ones that you might not have known about previously. And that can include, although it's not limited to, UX friction. So we'll look at that as well. And then finally, we combine sessions and issues with detailed product analytics with a goal of helping you optimize metrics like conversion rate, retention, and feature adoption. All right, so now that that's out of the way, we can go through our agenda for today. We're going to start by just putting a definition on this term, UX friction. We'll look at a useful framework for categorizing some of the various flavors of UX friction. We'll speak a bit about the need to actually balance some of these different flavors. Surprise, surprise, friction isn't actually always a bad thing. We'll also look at using UX friction as a guardrail, and then a few tips and strategies for identifying and addressing unnecessary instances of UX friction. So for the definition, I'm not sure who coined this term, but whoever it was really hit the nail on the head. It is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically anything that slows down or prevents a user from taking a desired action in your product. So it's just like if you're ice skating, you're eventually going to slow down and stop due to the friction between your skates and the ice. It really is exactly what it sounds like. So it sounds really simple, but as we'll see in a second, there's actually a fair bit of nuance to this topic. So I'm actually going to open up our first poll here. We're going to go through this idea of the hierarchy of UX friction. It's laid out by this person, Sachin Rekhi. He was a product leader at LinkedIn and went on to form his own startup company. But he laid out this hierarchy in a blog post on Medium in 2017. We're going to use his framework for part of this. All credit to Sachin. Okay, it looks like most have not. I'm seeing only 8% have. Okay, interesting. All right, so as you can see, he lays it out as essentially a pyramid with 3 different layers to it. So we'll go through this and explain what each form of user friction really means and look at a few examples of each. So starting off with emotional friction, and I think this is probably the most nuanced flavor of UX friction. I think normally when we think about this concept, we tend to think about our UIs, the number of steps it takes to complete an action, how intuitive is this flow to our users, what issues or bugs might be getting in their way, and so on. But it's important to consider all of the other potential sources of friction, even ones that are kind of abstract and separated from our products. So this idea of emotional friction is any kind of emotions your users feel that can prevent them from accomplishing their goal. So there's a lot of different good examples of this. I think the one that I like to use is this idea of a user applying for a new job on a site like Indeed. It's like a really big life decision. You might be feeling some emotions associated with moving on from your current position, maybe some fear, nervousness, guilt, something like that. So maybe some of us on the call have gone through a job application and then just sat on the final submit page, kind of pondering, is this something I'm really ready for? And that's not because you can't find the button or because the button doesn't work or you don't know where it is. It's because it's a big decision and it naturally elicits an emotional response. The second flavor here is this idea of cognitive friction, which basically means when the cognitive load is high on the user while completing a task, it means there is significant cognitive friction. So I think this is a little bit more in line with what people tend to think about, still a little bit abstract. So the example I like to use here, I actually have a Robinhood account, and a long time ago, I made the mistake of enabling options trading. And this is a very complex process. If anyone has ever traded options, there's this concept of the Greeks, which actually gets into some pretty advanced calculus and advanced mathematics. You have to consider different things like theta decay, IV crush. It's very, very complicated. And there's a reason why there are people who are smart and do that as a career instead of me doing it. But unfortunately for Robinhood's product team, there's not much they can do to make options trading more simpler inherently. But what they can do is simplify the way that we present these processes to our users. And we'll look at examples of that a little bit later. And then finally, I think this is probably the one that people tend to think of the most, being interaction friction, which is basically any friction a user experiences when interacting with your product's interface. So it can be things like, how many steps does it take to complete a certain action? How clear and intuitive is this flow to our users? And then alternatively, are there bugs or technical issues that are preventing a user from being able to move to the next step? Oh, I hope you did well, Sean, those Apple options. That's funny. All right, so we've went over the hierarchy, and I think it's very useful to categorize the different forms of friction. But if any of you go and read that blog post after the webinar, one thing you might notice is that it kind of ignores the interactivity of these various types of friction. I think that the pyramid graphic tends to represent it in kind of a siloed manner. They're stacked on top of one another and not really necessarily interrelating. So I think, and this is my spicy take, my addition to this framework, is that it's actually a better way to represent this as something of a bi-directional flywheel. It's not always going to be as simple as just removing friction wherever it pops up. In many cases, it's actually going to be necessary to introduce one type of friction in order to reduce or eliminate another. And this raises an important question, which is how can we make sure that we're balancing each form of UX friction in an optimal way? So let's look into a few examples where we can balance UX friction. All right, so some of you have probably heard of Guideline. It's a software product. A lot of small businesses use it to offer 401k plans to their employees. And something that would naturally be really important to a company like Guideline is making sure that users set up their portfolio in such a way that optimizes their chance of financial success. But it's not as simple as it sounds, because the environment is always changing. Interest rates are changing all the time. Stock performance has been variable. Bonds are becoming more and more profitable. So the portfolio that you allocated for yourself 1 or 2 or 3 years ago might no longer be the best fit for your personal goals. So in that sense, it's likely in Guideline's best interest to be intentional about directing users to review and update their portfolios. But unfortunately for them, it's one of those tasks that, like trading options, is very mentally taxing. So in this case, what we have to look to do is strike the proper balance between cognitive and interaction friction. So what the product team at Guideline has done in this case is introduce additional interactions, additional friction in the form of data collection. They start by asking you, what's your target retirement age? What's your personal risk tolerance? What's your level of investment experience? And then it eventually ingests this information and generates some recommendations for the users. But if you think of this, it could be accomplished in fewer steps. If they did something like simply saying, here are 3 different options, which one would you like to pick? That would, make it a bit quicker potentially in terms of the number of steps and the flow to complete this process. But it would put a lot more of that cognitive load back onto the user. And this brings up an important point, which is that friction, even interaction friction, isn't always a bad thing. Asking more questions and guiding the user to their preferred solution might technically mean that there have been more interactions introduced, but they serve a useful purpose. And the challenge becomes finding the right balance. Looking at another example here, this time balancing emotional and interaction friction. So going back to the example of the Indeed job site. Like I mentioned before, there are likely a lot of different emotions going through the user's head while they're applying to a new job. Things like fear, guilt, nervousness, maybe even excitement if we're lucky. But for today, we'll assume that the emotional friction is a roadblock. So what can we do to overcome this? Well, this is not actually what Indeed does. This is just one theory that I came up with. One possibility would be to show some kind of social proof and maybe trigger it based on some kind of time increment. So let's say that user is sitting on the submit page for more than 1 or 2 minutes. They've filled out all of the details, but they still haven't officially clicked submit and completed this application. So for us as PMs, it's hard to know, is this user actually sitting there contemplating this decision? Maybe they left their computer to go get a glass of water or trade some options on Robinhood. But we have to assume that there's some number of them who are nervous or afraid of taking this leap. So what they could consider doing is triggering some kind of a pop-up encouraging the user to take the leap using social proof with a testimonial from another user who found their dream job on Indeed and is now as happy as a clam. And maybe you could even do something like a trigger email along with this if the identity of this user is known. So once again, we're adding in an additional interaction, so friction, in order to reduce the emotional friction that user is feeling. All right, so this is getting complicated, right? It really is a balancing act. So I think you can break this down into a 3-step process. In order to get started here, you really need to establish a North Star metric that you want to optimize to. So for something like Indeed, it would probably be the % of users who complete that application flow. For Guideline, it might be the percentage of users who at least review or hopefully update their portfolio. If you don't know what you're ultimately looking to move the needle on, there's no point in doing anything. And I think one thing to keep in mind is we need to always be asking ourselves, are our goals aligning with the goals of our users? And I think in those couple of examples, in most cases, they are. Guideline users want to have the most profitable 401k, but we just need to be careful that we're not prioritizing our own interests for things like monetization without considering the impact on users. So once you've identified your goal and North Star, we can conduct comprehensive testing. And from there, perform cohort analysis and make a decision as to how to move forward. So we can look at an internal example from LogRocket, actually. So I'm sure, like many of you do, we have a self-service kind of PLG model where users can sign up, they can try the product, and they can purchase a plan all without ever talking to someone. And one of the key aha moments of value realization that we try to drive people towards is when a user installs LogRocket and records their first session replay. So it sounds simple, but it's actually very complicated because we have a technical product, and setting it up actually requires installing some JavaScript code into your production application. So for many of our users like PMs or marketers, this can be a very difficult task from a cognitive load standpoint, or it can be actually just impossible and they need to have someone else handle it for them entirely. So in order to address this problem, what we needed to do was offer a unique onboarding experience to non-developers. But clearly to do that, we first need to identify who's a developer, who's a PM, who's something else. So what we did was conduct a test where we implemented basically role collection as part of our onboarding process. We decided to start by simply testing this to see what is going to be the impact. And from there, the next step would be implement that personalized onboarding experience. So with this initial test, we actually had some really encouraging results. We did see a slight decline in conversion rate, but it wasn't statistically significant. So this is encouraging news to us, considering all of the positive long-term implications of a richer set of user data. We were very confident that implementing this additional friction was worth it and in line with our strategic goals. And we do also have to stop and think, is this also in line with the goals of our users? Which ultimately we decided, yes, it is, because everyone who signs up for a product wants to be able to successfully install it and test it. So providing a more catered and guided onboarding experience is obviously in line with this goal. All right, so while we're on the topic of cohort analysis, just wanted to point out here that LogRocket is actually a very useful tool for this purpose. What you can do is actually pass a custom event or a user trait to LogRocket, indicating, did this user receive the control or the variation for a particular test, and use our group by feature within a funnel to see how the conversion rate was impacted towards that North Star metric between your control and variation. So this is a good way to see, did your friction balancing act kind of pan out in the way that you had hoped? And I think there are a lot of tools that can be used to do that type of kind of basic data analysis. But one of the other benefits of using a tool like LogRocket is that we will actually link you to individual session replays. So those video replays, and you can narrow it down to a user within a particular variation who did or did not complete the intended action. So studying these qualitative videos can add a lot of context around what might be working, what might not be working in your variation. And you can, draw inferences and come up with additional hypotheses to test from there. All right, so we spoke quite a bit about how friction can be useful in terms of balancing other forms of friction, but I think it's worth pointing out that it can actually be useful in and of itself when implemented as a guardrail. Might be a little bit counterintuitive, but this example shows that introducing it can be a good thing, even without, the balancing act. And I think the most common example of this is using friction as a guardrail to make sure that our users don't make painful mistakes. And I have a really good real example of this. Here at LogRocket, we use a tool called Outreach, which is a sales engagement platform. And personally, as a marketing manager, I often have to queue up email programs for our team of SDRs. And it's a little bit scary because nobody ever wants to accidentally email hundreds of or thousands of people with the wrong thing. I've definitely never done that before. But in this example, Outreach is asking me to confirm, would you really like to sequence 3,526 prospects? And I like this for a lot of different reasons. Normally at this point in a project, I've spent hours or even days drafting messaging, isolating a list of targets, distributing leads out to the team. So I'm really not going to mind taking an extra 5 seconds at the end of the process to make sure I'm not screwing everything up right at the last second. And I also like that it actually makes you type in the number in order to proceed. I think all of us have probably like spam clicked past some kind of, yes, okay, confirm type prompt before. This design makes it pretty much impossible to do so. All right, so we talked a lot about how friction can actually be useful, but obviously that's not always going to be the case. So how can we actually put a definition on what constitutes unnecessary UX friction? And I think there's 2 different ways to define it. So let's say that we were running that test and we collected role information from our users. We implemented the personalized onboarding experience, and then voila, we actually had a net decline in conversion. That would be very surprising, but that would indicate this is unnecessary friction because it actually led to a net decline in our North Star metric. There will also be instances of UX friction that serve no helpful purpose and don't even attempt to serve a helpful purpose. So that is clearly bad and unnecessary. One example I've seen of this is when I'm trying to order my Chipotle burrito. The cookie banner will sometimes block the submit order button, and it takes me like a few seconds to figure out where the heck is the button? Like, why can't I click it? So that's bad. It just doesn't add any value. So how can we actually identify these instances of unnecessary friction in our products? So I'd recommend using a tool like LogRocket, and we have this concept of frustration signals. So a frustration signal is essentially something a user does or experiences during their session that is often associated with significant user frustration. So the first example is rage clicking or dead clicking. So when someone is angrily clicking the same button a bunch of times in quick succession, or trying to click something that's not actually a clickable button. We also have this concept of frustrating requests, which is a bit more technical in nature, but it results in a really poor UX experience, where essentially an API takes longer than 10 seconds to complete a call. It does ultimately complete, so a lot of product and engineering teams would miss this because they only look for failed requests, but it's going to cause significant slowness in the user's experience. We then have more simple things like funnel abandonment. Error states refer to business-defined problems, which are based on a particular element being visible on the page. So maybe you know that in certain cases, there will be a message like, oops, something went wrong. You can define that with no code and track user sessions for that with LogRocket. And then finally, poor performance, anything that leads to just significant slowness or lag from a user's perspective. All right, so we talked about these different friction points. How can we actually find them? Like, what would a typical workflow look like? So LogRocket offers a lot of advanced dashboarding and alerting features. So we can look at a quick example of a dashboard that you might use to identify some previously unknown friction points in your product. So there's a bunch of different options here. One thing that you could do is create a table of the most rage-clicked elements. And then from here, you're obviously able to click in and view those session replays to see what does this experience actually look like from the user's perspective. Is something really going wrong here, or are they just happening to rage-click here? Similarly, you could do percentage of overall sessions with the oops error message based on an error state. And something else is creating a session playlist. So from here, we could say, I want to see all sessions where there's a rage click on this particular URL of the app. And then you can actually click in. And this is what the session playback experience actually looks like. So everything that the user clicks, where they move the mouse, if it's mobile, where they're tapping, and you'd be able to see pretty quickly, is something actually going wrong here? And yeah, there was a question, is LogRocket available for web only? We actually support native mobile and web, so either would be supported. All right. And then one other thing to point out here, I'm sure some of you have probably used a session replay tool before, and something we've heard from users is they can be a little bit noisy if you don't know where to look to find helpful information. So the way that we've tried to solve for this is through this concept of issue tracking. So you can filter for things that are only user experience focused rather than technical issues. So things like rage clicks, dead clicks, those frustrating requests that might be causing slow experiences, and we'll automatically surface these to you. But we take that a step further through our machine learning algorithm that's been trained on billions of data points at this point, and we'll be able to surface to you the issues that we believe are actually most likely to be associated with significant user frustration. And this is becoming more and more accurate every day. We're getting some great feedback about it from our customers, so I would encourage everyone to check that out. All right. All right, so I think we could look, let's see. Session replay does not require payment or CC data entered, right? Yeah, absolutely. So there's extensive privacy controls with LogRocket. So we can actually do an approach where you would sanitize everything by default, or we can work backwards and say, we want to tag particular elements on the page and say LogRocket should not record these. So great question, but yeah, there's ways to certainly work with that. We have customers in banking and healthcare, finance, so we definitely have handled that. All right, so let's look at a real example of a rage click that actually represents something bad. So apologies if anyone is here from eBay, don't mean to do you dirty like this, but this is a real issue I experienced on the eBay website, where you can see I'm rage clicking this button, buy it now, and nothing is happening. I'm not able to buy it now, which is sad. But you can see we'd be able to find this through one of those tables or a session playlist and immediately see where in the event timeline something went wrong. Okay, and then a couple other questions. How do you identify emotional friction like fear or anxiety? That's a really good question. I'll attempt to answer that in a second, but it is the most complicated, I think. And then does LogRocket work on Flutter? Unfortunately, no, it is not supported. So I lost my tab. All right, and then the final example we'll look at here is one of a frustrating request, which is where there's basically a slow API call that's leading to significant slowness in the user's experience. And this is one, it might kind of look like Inception, where we used LogRocket to discover an issue on LogRocket. But what you can see, there's a network request taking over 10 seconds to load, and the user's session replay is just very slow to start loading, which is obviously a very poor experience. Session replay is one of the core features. Being able to quickly watch them is super important to us. So this is extremely unfortunate and something that we were able to quickly prioritize with our development team. And then, wrong tab. I'll attempt to answer this question about how we can identify emotional friction, because it's definitely the trickiest one. I think one thing that's super important is to look at the top and the bottom percentiles of critical metrics. I think a lot of us tend to look at averages a lot, which is helpful. There's a lot to be learned there, but there's also a lot to be learned by looking at the people who are either overcoming friction at the highest rate or struggling with it the most. So one thing that you would potentially be able to do is build a time between events metric. So saying, how long does it take a user to complete a certain action? I think one of the best ways that we have to identify that kind of emotional friction is just kind of a delay in a user taking an action. So we could look at, the 25th percentile, so the slowest cohort of people, and see, what does this experience look like? And then kind of analyze it from a logical perspective. Is there anything here that might constitute emotional friction? But by looking at the slowest and the fastest users, you're able to learn a lot about what people are struggling with and what successful experiences look like. And this is an example of time between events, but you could do time between events for, a lot of different things, or percentiles rather, for a lot of different things. All right, so we're getting close to the end here. To quickly recap things, this is the process I would suggest. Basically, monitor your application for frustration signals using LogRocket or a similar tool. Build some dashboards, set up some alerts on things that you know are important. And then consider the utility of any identified friction. Is this attempting to solve for something, or is it purely unnecessary? And if it's unclear, you can run tests and perform cohort analysis to make a determination. You can also watch individual user sessions to add context around these frustration signals, and then remove or simplify steps or fix issues in order to remove that friction. And then I'll also share this around in the follow-up email. This is a template. As a growth team, we actually are responsible for fixing issues on the LogRocket blog. So we use something that looks pretty similar to this to track some of the different issues that we find, and then understand, like, is there utility to this? Are we balancing it against another form of friction? What's the North Star metric? And is there any value here? All right, so I think I'd said friction less than 600 times, so I'll consider that a win, but that's all we have for you today. So I'll open it up for any additional questions. Would love to hear from you guys. Yeah, and good point by Luke. There is self-hosted options as well for running LogRocket. So in any kind of, secure industry, that's also something that we offer. All right, anything else? Yeah, we will absolutely send out the tracker after the call. Yeah, so the worksheet, it's really just like a tracker for the different instances of UX friction that you find. So here we'd be saying, like, we identified this via, some frustration signal in LogRocket or a user report. Maybe we introduced it intentionally in order to balance a different type of friction. So it's just a way of keeping track of things and organizing your thoughts. So we'll share that. You can clone it or potentially rebuild it in whatever kind of project management tool that you use. And then an example of a goal that aligns with your user when defining metrics. So I think the example of increasing the percentage of users who successfully record a session is an example of that. If you think of it like people sign up for a product for a reason, they want to be able to test LogRocket and record a session. So we might have to introduce a little bit of additional friction to make that possible for more people. But if at the end of the day, that's leading to an increase in the number of people who successfully activate, then I would say that that aligns with the user's goals as well. Another question. Different product instances for different customers. How does LogRocket be implemented to record all customer UX? So I believe we have this concept of projects within LogRocket where you can get a different like app ID for each instance of your product. So you'd be able to implement it that way. It's a pretty simple installation, just a script tag in the front end or NPM package. So we have definitely a bunch of customers with multi-tenant architectures. And then can we compare metrics against a standard or average metric collected? So something that you can do, sorry, I need to move the Zoom tabs out of the way. or I guess it would be kind of like this. So you could compare, I'm not sure if I'm interpreting the question correctly, but you could do something like 50th percentile for a particular metric. From all sessions we collect. Not really. What we would be able to do is with the issues product and the machine learning algorithm that is trained on data points from everyone who uses LogRocket. But yeah, we wouldn't be able to share any kind of like detailed metrics for other customers, unfortunately. Telemetry, what type of telemetry, Nicholas? I think the answer is yes. So in the session replay view, we capture a lot of technical information. This is the wrong tab. Yeah, I can show you that. So we capture, let me show you one in here. Yeah, so we capture things like core web vitals, CPU, network usage, average network speed. And then these are things that you can also build charts and dashboards off of as well. So you'll have them on the individual session level and on an aggregate level. Okay, another question. What are the common metrics that are identified as UX friction? I think you could do something like percentage of sessions with rage clicks, percentage of sessions with slow network requests, and just see like what is the frequency of these various things that are happening across your user base. And then you could also look at things like conversion rate, failed conversions, funnel abandonment. Abandonment can also be a pretty useful metric to look at. Yeah, and then Luke added his favorite is the 95th versus the 50th percentile for time between events. So you can compare people who make it through a process very quickly versus those who take a lot longer. Awesome, I love it. So many questions. I think, are we limited to a particular code? So LogRocket will only touch the front end of your application. So I think Java would be not relevant to what we do, but yeah, I think most of the applications we track are JavaScript-based web applications, and then most Android or iOS, but it would only be applicable to whatever your front-end language or framework is. Okay, just making sure that I didn't miss any questions here. I think we got to all of it. Is there anything else anyone wanted to ask before we wrap it up? All right, well, this was fun. Thanks everyone for joining today. Yeah, like I said, we'll send out the recording. I'll send a link to Sachin Rekhi's Hierarchy of User Friction so everyone can read that article, and we'll include the template for the friction tracker as well. All right, thanks everybody.